A house, cut off from the world. No phone, no school, no outside contact, just one man, and a family living like prisoners under his control. But no one knew. The pits dug in the backyard weren't for plumbing. They were graves, and only days later, those graves would be filled with his own wife, his children, and his blood. This is the story of the worst family massacre in American history. Welcome to Crime Whisper, where every story hides a secret, every whisper carries a truth, and every silence echoes with crime. Here, we unfold the darkest true crime stories, softly, but chilling enough to stay with you long after the video ends. In the quiet backwoods of Dover, Arkansas, stood an isolated home known as Mockingbird Hill, a 13-acre piece of land hidden from the world. No phone lines, no plumbing, no visitors. It wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. And at the center of it was Ronald Gene Simmons, born July 15, 1940, a former military man whose obsession with control had turned his home into something more sinister than anyone could imagine. Ronald had once served in both the Navy and Air Force, but instead of retiring into peace, he created his own personal army. His family, his wife Becky, and their 14 children were ruled under a regime of fear and obedience. Within those walls, there was no freedom. Only rules, restrictions, and silence. Every day followed a strict military-style routine. Ronald was the judge, the warden, and the law. No child was allowed to attend school. No one could interact with outsiders. Becky, once a lively young woman, now lived like a prisoner. In one of her hidden letters she wrote, "This house has become my prison." But her cries for help never reached the outside world. Neighbors barely knew the family. The house was surrounded by barbed wire and dense woods. A rusty no trespassing sign hung crooked at the entrance, warning others to stay away. Not that many dared to approach. Inside, Ronald had full psychological control. He monitored every movement. He isolated his children from the world, convincing them it was for their own safety. But the most disturbing sign of what was to come was something hidden in plain sight. Behind the house, Ronald instructed his children to dig large pits, claiming they were for a new septic system. In truth, those holes were graves, waiting to be filled. Mockingbird Hill was not just a home. It was a cage, a cult-like environment fueled by one man's desire to dominate everything around him. Ronald's darkness had found fertile ground in isolation. No one questioned him. No one stopped him. And so, quietly, brick by brick, rule by rule, he built the perfect place to carry out the unthinkable. This chapter marks the eerie calm before the storm, the beginning of what would become the worst family massacre in Arkansas history. Inside Mockingbird Hill, life was a carefully controlled nightmare. Ronald Gene Simmons didn't just isolate his family from the outside world, he erased their identities. Each member of the household lived under a strict regime, where even the smallest mistake could spark violent punishment. To outsiders, the family appeared to have vanished, but behind those walls, a silent horror was unfolding. Becky Simmons, Ronald's wife, bore the emotional weight of years of abuse. She had once dreamed of raising her children in peace, but that dream had turned into a slow, painful imprisonment. In one hidden letter she later left behind, she confessed, "He watches me while I sleep." Her words weren't poetic. They were literal. Ronald had developed a need to watch and control every move she made, even in her most vulnerable state. The children were never enrolled in school. Their names didn't appear in community records. They weren't allowed friends, conversations with strangers, or even questions about the world outside. What they learned from Ronald. And what they feared because of him. Punishment wasn't just verbal. Ronald used his fists. He used silence. He used fear. At times, he forced his children to stand in the cold, denied them food, and made them believe they were nothing without his approval. They were taught that obedience was survival. The house itself was falling apart. Leaks, broken windows, and foul smells were never fixed. But Ronald didn't care. He didn't want a home. He wanted a fortress. He didn't want comfort. He wanted power. Then came a disturbing task. Ronald ordered his children to dig a deep trench in the backyard. He told them it was for plumbing. In reality, these were the same pits that would soon become mass graves. No one questioned him. Not Becky, not the children. By now, everyone knew. Questioning Ronald meant pain. Becky, in quiet moments, tried to imagine escape. She wrote secret letters. She planned silently with one of her daughters. But escape from Ronald meant more than running. It meant surviving the storm that would surely follow. Still, Becky dreamed of freedom. If not for herself, then at least for her children. This chapter exposes the deep emotional manipulation, the psychological breakdown of a once normal family, and the terrifying silence that echoed through Mockingbird Hill. What began as control had now turned into psychological torture, and Ronald was just getting started. By the early 1980s, Ronald Gene Simmons's abusive control reached its most disturbing form. His eldest daughter, Sheila Simmons, b. 1963, became the victim of incest. In 1981, she gave birth to a baby girl named Sylvia Gale Simmons, whose biological father was, horrifyingly, her own father, Ronald. Even more shocking, Ronald didn't hide it. He openly told relatives and neighbors that the child was his. When Ronald Jr., Sheila's brother, learned the truth, he reported the situation to school authorities. That led to an official investigation by the Department of Human Services, DHS. But before legal action could be taken, Ronald fled with the entire family. He moved them from Cloudcroft, New Mexico, to Mockingbird Hill, a remote property in Dover, Arkansas, in 1983. It was a calculated escape, allowing him to avoid prosecution and further isolate his family from outside interference. Sheila, deeply traumatized, eventually escaped from the household. She married Dennis McNulty, a man from outside the family, and began trying to rebuild her life. But Ronald never let go. His obsession with Sheila and with Sylvia, who was both his daughter and granddaughter, never faded. This chapter lays bare the monstrous transformation of Ronald, from a strict patriarch to a predator who violated the deepest boundaries of trust. It also marks a tragic turning point. An opportunity to stop him had come, but because of bureaucratic failure and fear within the family, it slipped away. Following the DHS investigation into Ronald's incestuous abuse of his daughter Sheila, the Simmons family vanished from New Mexico in 1983. Ronald uprooted everyone and relocated to a remote, wooded property in Dover, Arkansas, known as Mockingbird Hill. It was a 14-acre plot, fenced with barbed wire, isolated from neighbors, and deliberately without basic utilities like a phone or plumbing. Here, Ronald built a fortress of secrecy. He controlled all movement, cut the family off from society, and enforced his rigid rules without oversight. His paranoia grew, and so did his desire for complete dominion over his household. Meanwhile, Sheila Simmons, now a young woman, managed to escape his grip. She married Dennis McNulty, a kind man from outside the family, and together they began raising Sylvia, the child born from Ronald's abuse. For a while, Sheila was free, living a normal life, apart from the darkness she had endured. But Ronald couldn't let go. He remained obsessed with Sheila and Sylvia, whom he considered his creations. Even in isolation, he maintained control over the remaining family and continued to manipulate their reality. His wife, Becky Simmons, emotionally shattered, stayed silent, her once documented escape plans fading into despair. This chapter explores Ronald's calculated retreat into rural Arkansas, a move that allowed his crimes to go undetected. It also highlights the brief glimmer of hope in Sheila's escape and the tragic knowledge that her story, despite her courage, would eventually circle back into the nightmare she fled. It was just 3 days before Christmas when Ronald Gene Simmons launched his horrific plan. On December 22, 1987, inside the walls of his isolated Arkansas home, he began systematically murdering his own family. His first victim was his long-suffering wife, Becky Simmons, whom he strangled with his bare hands. Then came Loretta, his daughter-in-law, followed by several of his grandchildren, including Eddie, Marianne, Barbara, and Billy. He used a chilling mix of strangulation, shooting, and drowning in water barrels to kill them all. Some of the children were lured with kindness, then executed. Ronald worked quietly, methodically, without panic or remorse. He had already prepared the cesspit behind his home, and he dumped the bodies there one by one, like they were objects, not family. No neighbors heard anything. No one came to check. The house was surrounded by fencing, and Ronald had ensured no phone line existed. His remaining child, Wren, unaware of what had happened, were scheduled to arrive later for Christmas. Ronald waited. He even cleaned up and watched TV as if nothing had happened. This chapter marks the descent into absolute horror. Ronald didn't kill out of rage. He did it out of control, cold calculation, and a desire to end what he considered a failed family. The seeds of this massacre had been growing for years. This was the harvest. On December 26, 1987, 4 days after the first killings, Ronald Gene Simmons' estranged daughter, Sheila Simmons McNulty, returned home for the holidays. She arrived with her husband Dennis McNulty, their son Michael, and her daughter Sylvia Gale Simmons, who was both Ronald's granddaughter and biological daughter due to the incestuous abuse. They walked into a house of death, unaware of the horrors that had already unfolded. Ronald welcomed them coldly. Within hours, he shot and killed all 4 of them. Sheila, once the center of Ronald's obsession and rage, was gunned down alongside her husband and children. Ronald buried their bodies in the backyard, separate from the cesspit where he had hidden the earlier victims. This separation may have been symbolic. Sheila was different to him, emotionally and psychologically. By this point, Ronald had killed 10 of his family members in a span of days. What's chilling is the complete emotional detachment. No panic, no guilt. He followed a pattern with near-military discipline, disposing of each body with precision. This chapter is particularly haunting because Sheila had once tried to break free. She had reported the abuse. She had married, left, and built a new life. But returning to that house, even for a brief holiday visit, led to her brutal end. Ronald's need for control could not allow her to live beyond him. The bodies were now hidden. The silence of Mockingbird Hill was deafening, and Ronald still wasn't finished. By December 28, 1987, 6 days after murdering his entire family, Ronald Gene Simmons calmly left his blood-soaked home and drove to Russellville, Arkansas, prepared for one final act of destruction. But this time, his targets weren't family. They were former co-workers, supervisors, and others he believed had wronged him. He first entered the office of Pepsi Cola, where he used to work, and killed Kathy Kendrick, a young secretary who had rejected his sexual advances in the past. Then he moved on to a law office, injuring multiple people. At Woodline Motor Freight, another former workplace, he killed J.D. Chaffin and seriously wounded the company's owner. Ronald continued this spree across 7 locations. His attacks were cold, methodical, and without any emotion. In each place, he calmly walked in, shot his targets, and moved on. He carried a .22 caliber pistol and never tried to escape. At the final location, an office he once worked in, Ronald waited for the police to arrive. He handed over his gun and simply said, "I've done what I came to do. It's all over now. I've gotten everybody who wanted to hurt me." In total, he had now killed 16 people, 14 family members and 2 during the rampage, and injured at least 4 others. The spree shocked the state of Arkansas and the entire nation. What made it even more chilling was his lack of remorse and calm demeanor. This chapter marks the public face of the monster that had remained hidden in the woods. Ronald Gene Simmons was no longer just a family annihilator. He had become one of the deadliest mass murderers in U.S. history, and he surrendered with pride, not shame. As the world tried to understand how such a brutal massacre could happen, attention turned to the 2 most tragic yet brave figures in the Simmons family, Becky and Sheila. Their stories weren't just of victims. They were stories of silent resistance, buried pain, and unspoken cries for help. Becky Simmons, Ronald's wife of over 2 decades, had endured years of psychological and physical abuse. She had written secret letters to friends and relatives describing her home as a prison, and Ronald as a man who watched her like a warden. In one particularly chilling diary entry, she wrote, "He watches me while I sleep. I don't know what's left of me." She wanted to escape. Quietly, she had made plans to run away with her children once they were old enough. But fear and Ronald's total control over communication made it nearly impossible. Then there was Sheila Simmons, born in 1963, and perhaps the most heartbreaking character in this story. She had been the victim of Ronald's incest. She gave birth to Sylvia Gale Simmons in 1981, a child fathered by her own father. And yet, Sheila tried to speak out. It was Ronald Jr., Sheila's brother, who finally reported the abuse to school officials. This led to a DHS investigation, but Ronald fled before any action could be taken. Sheila left home as soon as she could. She married Dennis McNulty and tried to build a new life, far from her father's reach. But Ronald never let go. He stayed obsessed with both Sheila and Sylvia, his daughter and granddaughter. But biologically, both were his children. His twisted sense of ownership and betrayal only grew. On December 26, 1987, Sheila returned home for Christmas. What she didn't know was that Ronald had already murdered her mother, siblings, nieces, and nephews. Within moments of entering the house, Sheila, Dennis, and Sylvia were shot dead. Both Becky and Sheila had tried to fight back in their own silent ways. But in a world where no one listened closely enough, their resistance wasn't enough to stop the horror. This chapter is a heart-wrenching reflection on the cost of silence, the trauma of control, and the unsung courage of two women whose cries for help went unheard until it was too late. By the time Ronald Gene Simmons stood trial, the state of Arkansas and the entire country was stunned by the scale and brutality of his crimes. The court proceedings were swift, largely because Ronald refused to fight back. He didn't plead for mercy. He didn't show remorse. He wanted to die. Simmons was tried in two separate court cases, one for the 14 family murders and another for the 2 public killings and injuries in Russellville. In both cases, the juries had little deliberation. The evidence was overwhelming, and Ronald's own behavior sealed his fate. When offered the right to appeal, Ronald declined. He wrote, "To prolong this trial would be cruel. Any punishment short of death would be unfair." His cold logic was terrifying. He didn't scream, cry, or attempt to explain his actions. Psychiatrists declared him mentally competent, not insane. He simply believed in control until the end, even over how and when his life should end. In May 1989, Simmons received 2 death sentences. But unlike most death row inmates who spend years fighting execution, Ronald requests that the sentence be carried out as soon as possible. In 1990, Governor Bill Clinton, years before his presidency, signed the execution order. On June 25, 1990, Ronald Gene Simmons was executed by lethal injection at Cummins Unit in Lincoln County, Arkansas. He offered no final words, no apology, no explanation. He lay still as the drugs entered his veins, his face expressionless. In his final moments, there was no emotion, no visible regret. Just a man who had orchestrated every moment of his life and death. His grave was left unmarked by his own request. Public opinion was deeply divided. Some believed justice had finally been served, that evil had been silenced. Others, especially mental health professionals, were left disturbed, not by his execution, but by how calmly he accepted it. This chapter closes the story of Ronald's physical life, but it opens the door to darker questions. Was this a man evil from the start, or a product of abuse and trauma? And most painfully, how many chances did society have to stop him before it was too late? Even after Ronald Gene Simmons was executed, the chilling echoes of his crimes never truly faded. What he did was unthinkable, but what haunted many even more was how preventable it might have been. In the aftermath of the massacre, investigators, psychologists, and journalists dug deep into Ronald's past, searching for answers. What they found wasn't just the profile of a killer. It was the story of a man shaped by silence, abuse, and systemic failure. Ronald had grown up under emotional neglect, suffering through frequent relocations, a controlling stepfather, and early exposure to authoritarian environments. His time in the military may have given him structure, but it also reinforced his need for control, a control he later forced on his wife and children. Experts argued this wasn't just about one man's madness. It was about a pattern of warning signs that were ignored. When Ronald's own son, Ronald Jr., reported him for sexually abusing his sister Sheila in 1981, the state began an investigation, but it stalled and Ronald escaped before authorities could act. That was the moment the system failed, said one former DHS official. Ronald moved to Mockingbird Hill, built a wall around his family, and tightened his grip until they could barely breathe. Yet no one from law enforcement or social services followed up. No welfare checks, no monitoring, nothing. Even Becky, Ronald's wife, tried reaching out. Her private letters revealed she was scared, trapped, and watching her family crumble. But no one heard her. Or if they did, they didn't listen closely enough. In interviews conducted years later, former neighbors and co-workers admitted they'd felt something was wrong, but had stayed quiet. In a small town, people often mind their own business, even when they shouldn't. Ronald's story became more than a crime. It became a case study in institutional failure. How many Sheilas are out there, afraid to speak? How many Beckys, writing letters no one will ever read? In the years since, Arkansas and other states have updated child protection laws and improved intervention systems. But the pain remains. This chapter doesn't just ask, why did this happen? It asks, why didn't anyone stop it? The case of Ronald Gene Simmons did not end with his execution. The true horror lingered long after his death, in the leet. Vests shattered, in the unanswered questions, and in the eerie silence left behind at Mockingbird Hill. After the massacre, the Simmons property stood abandoned, a haunting symbol of everything that went wrong. The rusted gate, the overgrown grass, the empty foundation where the house once stood, all reminders of a home that had become a graveyard. Survivors, distant relatives, and community members struggled with the weight of grief and disbelief. No one had ever imagined that a man could murder his own blood so methodically, so coldly. But perhaps the deepest wound was not just the number of victims, it was who the victims were. His own children, grandchildren, his wife, his daughter, even the child he fathered through incest. In the years following his execution in 1990, the story of Ronald Gene Simmons became a fixture in crime documentaries, psychology courses, and criminal justice reform debates. His name, once unknown, was now etched in history as the perpetrator of the worst family massacre in U.S. history. Journalists continued to write about the case. Scholars analyzed his mental state, but some things were never fully understood. Like what exactly snapped inside him in December 1987? Was it a final act of control, a desire for revenge, or had the madness been brewing for decades, unseen beneath a mask of authority and quiet dominance? The final echoes of this tragedy aren't just in books or documentaries. They exist in every law that was strengthened after the fact, in every social worker who now pushes harder when they see a warning sign, and in every family that learned to speak out, even when it's hard. In a small graveyard in Arkansas, many of the victims rest side by side, including Sheila, Sylvia, and Becky. Their headstones bear simple inscriptions, but their story is anything but simple. It's a brutal reminder that evil can grow in silence and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters live within the walls of our own homes. And so, the case of Ronald Gene Simmons may be closed, but the horror and the lessons still echo.